Can we learn from history? Today, I want to make the case that we can, using one example and one example only, the United States of America. Now, people are always going on and on about how young this country is, when, in reality, the American system of government is one of the oldest in the world, enshrined in the earliest written constitution, still in use today. Germany and Italy are both younger states by comparison, and though England, Spain, France, and other nations were already in existence, their current systems of government were much more recently adopted. France, for example, has gone through 14 different constitutions since 1789. However, despite ours being such an old and venerable republic, these days there's a lot of talk about an American empire, an empire in decline.
Our company is a declining empire inside a declining empire.
Amen, brother.
People are killing themselves with guns or dope so fast that we're losing pace.
Unsubscribe.
Ignore that last bit. Obviously, there's more to this decline narrative, as simply calling America a late-stage empire hardly makes for a juicy headline. But copy-paste a little Edward Gibbon and say that America is having its late-stage Roman Empire moment, and you probably get 10 times as many clicks. People have been making those kinds of comparisons since Nixon at least, sometimes with a good deal of historical erudition, and other times less so.
Last 6 Roman emperors.
Wasn't always that way though. Before the stagflationary 70s, America's associations to the past were just as optimistic as its visions of the future. People used to say that America was to Rome what Britain was to Greece, that hegemony had passed from Rome to Britain to America, and that the rest of the world was better off for it. They spoke of a Pax Romana, a Pax Britannica, and a Pax Americana, saying that these were periods of unprecedented peace and stability. Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan just about put an end to that story, but the one constant throughout all this time has been America's self-identification with Rome, whether as republic or empire. In fact, this self-identification goes all the way back to the beginning, to the founding fathers themselves. If you're a product of the American education system like me, you were probably taught that the revolution had a lot to do with the Enlightenment, a new movement with new thinkers, new ideas, and new principles. The Roman Republic might get a passing mention in the same breath as Athenian democracy, but that's about it. For the most part, it's ancient history one year, American history the next. But the fact of the matter is that if you take Rome out of the equation, you cannot tell America's story. Today, I'll explain why that is and what it meant for the newly United States of America. Ultimately, I'll be making the case that this country is the founders' new and innovative answer to an age-old question. Rome fell, but did it have to?
The sensational scenes as Mr. Churchill makes his fighting speech to the United States Congress.
Winston Churchill once remarked that we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. For anyone who's been to our nation's capital, like the half-American Churchill himself, this is a truth that resonates. If you look carefully, DC is basically a who's who of the Greco-Roman world. You have a Senate meeting in a Capitol, and Republicans up against Democrats. You have a Supreme Court that looks like an Athenian temple, a Lincoln Memorial that looks like the Parthenon, and a Jefferson Memorial that looks like the Pantheon. The same story, carved into marble and granite, is printed on cotton linen paper money. Take a look at the backside of a $1 bill. You'll find it reads like a Total War loading screen, featuring not one, not two, but 3 Latin proverbs, one of which is the nation's unofficial motto. But at no point in American history did antiquity so dominate our discourse as during the Revolutionary period. This was a time when politicians modeled themselves on Cicero, a time when being called Catiline was as bad as being called Hitler, a time when your average Joe quoted Seneca because he read him in Poor Richard's Almanac, and even a time when the most popular piece of entertainment was Joseph Addison's Cato, a Tragedy. This was the Hamilton of that era, overtly political and highly quotable.
Oh, don't worry, Greg. It's a nice safe space where you don't have to pretend to like Hamilton.
Well, I like Hamilton.
Sure you do. We all do.
A play that George Washington stages at Valley Forge and quotes in a letter to Benedict Arnold. A play that inspired the single most famous revolutionary catchphrase, "Give me liberty or give me death," which I can't help but compare to getting your campaign slogan from a Marvel movie.
I think Kamala Harris needs a catchphrase.
Ooh, yes, definitely a catchphrase.
Nor did the buck stop at plays. Back then, no speech was concluded, no letter sealed, without at least a handful of ancient allusions. John Locke, Montesquieu, the founders, they were all constantly reading the ancients, mostly Aristotle, Plutarch, Cicero, and Polybius. In school, I remember hearing all about Locke and Montesquieu, but I don't think anyone ever mentioned Polybius, or the fact that he had written about the separation of powers 2 millennia earlier. Nor was it mentioned that, like Montesquieu himself, the founders were educated enough to consult the ancients for inspiration. The Harvard-educated John Adams confessed that we are so bigoted to Thucydides, Livy, Plutarch, and Tacitus, Hume, Robertson, and Gibbon that we read little else.
Sadly, that is very well said.
Even George Washington, who was comparatively less educated than his peers, owned a copy of Plutarch's Lives, and, like them, he could also drop the occasional classical reference, probably after hearing rather than reading it. But this antiquity mania was more all-encompassing than that. It could rear its marbled head, sometimes literally, in everything from home decor to garden arrangements to love letters to pet names to funerary inscriptions. At Monticello, which Thomas Jefferson designed with the Pantheon in mind, a statue of the mythical Princess Ariadne serves as the centerpiece of his front hall. At James Madison's Montpellier, Athena and Homer greet visitors as busts in the drawing room. John Adams was less well-to-do than these wealthy Virginian planters, but that does not mean that he was any less versed in the classics. While courting Abigail, his soon-to-be wife, the two called themselves Lysander and Diana, and after passionate courtship gives way to tranquil domesticity, Adams instructs her in one letter not to overfeed the mare Cleopatra. Monticello's stables had studs named Caractacus after a Brittonic chieftain, Tarquin after the last Roman king, and Diomede after a hero of the Trojan War. More disturbingly, Jefferson also had Jupiter, Caesar, and Hercules for slaves, just as Washington had Neptune and Cupid, and Madison Plato. All that said, antiquity was not simply a source of names, one-liners, and aesthetic inspiration. It was a shared cultural and political framework, revolving around the concept of virtue. This is a word that appears over 6,000 times in the collected writings of the Founding Fathers, more often even than freedom. That's because the concept of virtue underpins everything these statesmen said and did, meaning, ladies and gentlemen, that the founders of the United States were virtue signalers. But not in the way that you might think. Back then, the word virtue had a very different meaning. The closest synonym was manliness, as the word virtue is derived from the Latin virtus, the root vir, meaning man. It's a term that goes back to the days of the Roman Republic, co-opted in the Renaissance by Romaboos like Machiavelli. Now fast forward to the Enlightenment, and virtue becomes, according to one historian, the very linchpin of public life, a fact which underscores why this term was bandied around so much. However, then as now, virtuous deeds spoke louder than virtuous words, and that is why of all the founders, George Washington was the most virtuous of all. While his peers in Congress were busy impersonating Cicero, Washington proved equally suited to 3 entirely different roles: Fabius, Cincinnatus, and Cato. These were 3 of the Republic's greatest heroes, all of them selfless, dignified, and of course virtuous. The first role, that of Fabius, did not come naturally to a man like Washington. Despite his carefully cultivated reputation, this was not a man without a certain temper or temerity. But by the time of the Revolution, he was a man in control of himself, a leader who understood the demands of military necessity and had for an aide the brilliant Alexander Hamilton. It was this very aide, the future Secretary of the Treasury, that best summed up the Fabian strategy of the Continental Army. The circumstances of our country put it in our power to evade a pitched battle. It will be better policy to harass and exhaust the soldiery by frequent skirmishes and incursions than to take the open field with them, by which means they would have the full benefit of their superior regularity and skill. Fabius himself could hardly have done it better, even if it must be confessed that the British had no Hannibal to lead them. Washington's next role is that of Cincinnatus, a Roman general entrusted with dictatorial powers who saves the Republic and quietly retires to his farm. Sound familiar? This is basically what Washington does after leading the country to victory, serving 2 presidential terms, and unproblematically retiring to his Virginia estate. In the process, he set a precedent that remained unbroken until the extraordinary presidency of FDR. Washington's third and final role is that of Cato the Younger, basically the final boss of Roman virtue. Fighting all his life to preserve the Republic, he proved to be one of the bitterest foes that Julius Caesar faced. And believe me when I say, there's a reason they made a play about the guy. Here was a man who took his own life rather than accept the clemency of a dictator. Plutarch recounts that Cato botched the first attempt and was basically put on suicide watch only to then tear out his bandages, with them his guts, and thereby succeed in this act of ritual suicide. To George Washington's generation, this was the very pinnacle of virtue, the kind of machismo, honor, selflessness, and pride that gradually disappeared as republic turned to empire. That brings us to one of the most frequently asked questions in all of history, the question of how the Romans lost their virtue. Nowadays, that same essential question crops up in discussions about hard men creating good times and weak men creating bad times. And as it turns out, the Romans were having the very same discussions. In Germania and Agricola, both of which are supposed to be ethnographies, Tacitus ends up saying more about his fellow Romans than about either the Germans or the Britons. This was not a historian in the mold of Herodotus, who actually visited the places he talked about. No, Tacitus was less interested in ethnography and more interested in political and social commentary about his fellow countrymen. From his vantage point in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the empire may have been civilized, but it was consequently plagued by weakness, decadence, and sloth. This made the Romans the weak men in his narrative, while the Germans and Britons emerge as the, let us say,
strong, silent type.
It's a sobering thing to see written in the midst of the Pax Romana, especially coming from a writer that Jefferson considered the first in the world without a single exception. Having himself once written about the Saxons who left their native wilds and woods in the north of Europe and possessed themselves on the island of Britain, Tacitus was right up Jefferson's alley. But there was another writer, one who lived in the 1st century BC and was arguably even more prescient than Tacitus. His name, the anglicized version anyway, is Sallust, and more than 100 years before Tacitus, he had already pinpointed the moment that Rome's decline began. To Sallust, the decisive moment came in 146 BC, the year the Republic finally defeated Carthage. From this point onward, he says, the Romans stopped being virtuous because they no longer needed to be. They had made the Mediterranean their lake, and the world their oyster. But if you buy that, you gotta grapple with the fact that the Republic lasted another 119 years, the Empire another 503, and the eastern half another 977. The founders weren't so interested in the imperial chapters of this story. Instead, they fixated on those 119 years that remained to the Roman Republic. As we've discussed, these were men of their time, philosophes of the Enlightenment, and Englishmen whose members of parliament were already cosplaying as Roman Republicans. The English think they have taken from the government of the Romans all that is best and corrected its faults, said the French foreign minister, a joke to him, but not the founding fathers. Their sincere intention was to improve on the Roman Republic, which is why they surrounded themselves with antiquity and studied the ancients with such great fervor. I know I quoted him once already, but there's no helping the fact that Churchill put it best. Study history, study history, study history, he once said to an American student. In history lie all the secrets of statecraft. Sure enough, there was one ancient writer with perhaps the greatest secret of them all. I've mentioned him twice already, and though his origins were Greek, his interests were decidedly Roman. Can anyone be so indifferent or idle as not to care to know by what means and under what kind of polity almost the whole inhabited world was conquered and brought under the dominion of the single city of Rome? That is Polybius, who lived and worked in the 2nd century BC and whose claim to fame is cracking the riddle behind Rome's invincibility? The answer, according to Polybius, was the separation of powers. This allowed Rome to blend the merits of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy without backsliding into their shadow forms, tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule, respectively. In the case of the Romans, the monarchy was embodied by the consuls, the aristocracy by the Senate, and the democracy by the tribunes. As historian and philosopher Hannah Arendt would have put it, power checked power, at least in theory. It is because of Polybius, along with their contemporary Montesquieu, that the founders decided on a mixed government with roughly hewn checks and balances. A president to embody the monarch, a senate to embody the aristocracy, and a House of Representatives as the full embodiment of democracy. Since then, the balance of power has obviously shifted around. After 1913, for example, senators were no longer appointed by state legislatures and instead elected directly by the people, making them that much less aristocratic. There's also been the emergence of everything from multinational corporations to political action committees to trade unions, intelligence agencies, and standing committees. Whether public or private, state or non-state, all of these newly cast actors affect our politics in one way or another. Much of it would have left the founders confused and probably concerned, but on a fundamental level, they understood the need to adapt. Is it not the glory of Americans, asks James Madison, that whilst they have paid a decent regard to the opinions of former times and other nations, they have not suffered a blind veneration to antiquity to overrule the suggestions of their good sense and the lessons of their own experience. Coming from the father of the Constitution, this is a consequential but ultimately unsurprising thing to hear. The founders understood change to be necessary. It's why we have constitutional amendments in the first place. They knew that future Americans would need to innovate, just like they did when creating the Supreme Court. In an age when kings were judge, jury, and executioner, separating the executive from the judiciary was a very novel step. And today it is this separation of power between the legislative, judicial, and executive that every kid learns in school. At this point, it's worth recounting how antiquity went out of fashion, how it became less and less a part of our discourse until the last half-century or so. After the American Cato and Cicero, i.e. Washington and Adams, Jefferson became the third president of the United States of America. Of all the founding fathers, he was probably the second most impressive polymath behind Benjamin Franklin, and he was also far more interested in the Greeks, aesthetically and intellectually. Contrary to what we learned at school, the founders didn't really care all that much about ancient Athens or its short-lived democracy. Their model, as we have established already, was the Roman Republic. Jefferson's Grecophilia thus made him an exception to the rule, especially when it came to Xenophon. Besides Plato, who Jefferson despised, Xenophon was the only contemporary source of the great philosopher Socrates. And compared to Plato, Xenophon paints a very different Socratic portrait, turning a pretentious scholar into a simple farmer. Like Tacitus, Xenophon was music to Jefferson's ears, aligning with his vision of America as a republic of yeoman farmers. Already by the start of his presidency, a political and social transition was well underway in the country. It came in the form of partisanship, the rise of the Federalists and Democratic Republicans, America's first political parties. During Washington's farewell address, most of it ironically ghostwritten by Hamilton, the outgoing president warned against partisanship, and his successor, John Adams, fought it tooth and nail. To Adams, parties represented factionalism and were equivalent to treason. They brought to mind the most famous conspiracy against the Roman Republic, conspiracy of Catiline, which happened to be revolutionary America's favorite cautionary tale. In his struggle against partisanship, Adams saw himself as Cicero, the novus homo, or new man, who brought the silver spoon Catiline to justice. But the new Cicero proved less successful, and ultimately the Democratic Republicans were triumphant. Under Jefferson and Madison's leadership, this party went head-to-head against Hamilton's Federalists on everything from states' rights to agrarianism to the French Revolution. By the end of Jefferson's presidency, during which time he doubled the nation's size through the Louisiana Purchase, the shift toward partisanship and away from antiquity was reconfirmed. The names would change, but partisanship was here to stay. Despite all that, Jefferson returned to the classics in his post-presidential years, writing to Madison at the ripe old age of 69 that he now thought little of politics, that he had given up newspapers in exchange for Tacitus and Thucydides, for Newton and Euclid, and was happier for it. Jefferson was succeeded by his fellow partisan James Madison, the fourth president of the United States. His political genius rested in consistently being on the winning side of any given issue. Though he was hardly the most eloquent founding father, it's been joked that most of early America's history boils down to Madison talking to himself, co-authoring the Federalist Papers, orchestrating, recording, and commenting on the Constitutional Convention, and then introducing the Bill of Rights. More than any of his peers, Madison approached history like a political scientist, embarking on a systematic study of republics in preparation for the constitutional assemblies. In this, he was aided by his friend and ally Jefferson, who sent countless books across the Atlantic during his diplomatic excursions in France. Between Madison and Hamilton, the co-authors of the Federalist Papers, it is Madison who comes across as more historically erudite, drawing references not only to Greece and Rome, but even to the contemporary Holy Roman Empire. Like Jefferson, though, Madison was a political animal, arguably one of the savviest politicians among the founding fathers. Rather than reversing the shift away from antiquity, he helped bring it about by advancing the agenda of the Democratic Republicans. He was in turn succeeded by the last founder president, James Monroe, after whom the Old Boys Club concluded with John Quincy Adams. Like his father, Adams was doomed to a one-term presidency, and to add insult to injury, he was followed by a man he considered a barbarian. This outsider was none other than Andrew Jackson, who, it is safe to say, probably spent little time thinking about antiquity. The revolutionary generation had been a different breed. They had immersed themselves in antiquity to such an extent that even their concerns were antique in nature. Most of all, they had worried about what would happen when America lost its virtue, all while the issue of slavery remained unresolved. By the 19th century, whatever remained of the cult of antiquity was hijacked by the American South in defense of their cause. Southerners argued that since the Greeks and Romans had slaves, the institution of slavery was not incompatible with the cherished principle of liberty. But this glaring contradiction would not survive the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, and by the time this great emancipator was dead, slavery, much like antiquity, was a thing of the past.
All that to say, it's interesting and exciting to see antiquity make such a comeback, appearing in our films, shows, TikTok trends, and news articles. And while I don't think we'll see Trump quoting Cicero anytime soon, I do think we as a nation will continue looking at Rome for entertainment and edification alike. I guess my last 2 cents are that the founders had a point, and that while we spend all this time looking at the Roman Empire, the late Republic might just have a bit more to teach us.